A recent trend in popular criticism is pointing out plot holes in movies. If a movie doesn't make sense, then it is fundamentally flawed and ridiculed for it. We have several hour-long videos nitpicking every plot point and how it's inconsistent with both the world building and the self-contained story. But do plot holes really matter? No. Before I continue, it's going to be necessary to define what a plot hole is. If this seems insignificant, consider this. The eagles not flying a ring bearer to Mordor in Lord of the Rings. Is this a plot hole? Some will answer no, because there is a good reason for it, and that the logic of the world fits, and that's good enough. If this is the case, world building and verisimilitude matter more than logic. Others will say that it is a plot hole because whether the world building is right or wrong, much of the narrative hinges on an egregious illogical error. In that case, natural logic matters more than world building. It's also possible to say that any part of a story that goes unexplained is a plot hole. I'll go ahead and clear the air and define a plot hole as follows: a contradiction or gap in the logic of the plot. But there are at least two big reasons why this plot hole, along with other plot holes, don't matter. Firstly, good storytelling comes first. And secondly, the existence of a plot hole doesn't tell me how to think about a film or book. Okay, so let's continue with the Eagles example since it's maybe the most famous. If a review said that Lord of the Rings is bad because it has a plot hole, the reviewer would be charged and sentenced for crimes against storytelling. But if we take the same stance as some critics do with the Star Wars sequels, then we'd have to call Lord of the Rings a failure. But most critics don't call the movies or books failures. Lord of the Rings is one of the best stories ever written. That's because it's a good story despite the plot hole. If the Eagles did ferry everyone to the mountain, there would be no story. You really can't have a logical, realistic story and a good story. Or maybe you can, but there aren't that many. You can have a believable story and a good story, but realism and believability are two very different things. If you're willing to suspend your disbelief, a fantasy world with elves and trolls is believable, the same way that a dream is believable. But it isn't realistic. A realistic Lord of the Rings would look very different from what we got, which is fine because a realistic Lord of the Rings would suck. Consider what a realistic zombie apocalypse story would look like. Everyone would be dead within a week. I mean, we all saw what happened with COVID. Some people would go running outside trying to get bitten on purpose, thinking it'd be a good thing or something, or maybe the zombies are just actors. But a heroic tale of persevering against all odds, battling uncountable ranks of undead? Now you have a story. All stories, including Lord of the Rings, follow a recipe. They are inherently formulaic, finely tuned to bring a good experience, not a logical or realistic experience. Most stories in real life aren't following a recipe. Our lives are messy and chaotic, and when they are formulaic, they're boring. I wake up, go to work, come home, go to sleep. That's not an interesting story. There are more than 8 billion people on Earth. The stories we hear on the news or podcasts are statistical exceptions, assuming that they're even true to begin with. They are just 1 out of the 8 billion. Now that doesn't mean you have a 1 in 8 billion chance of having an interesting story about your life. I mean, mine is actually lower, but for most people, the odds of having a story that isn't embellished but also wholly authentic and interesting is very low. The truth is that a completely logical and realistic story with no plot holes would be an uninteresting story. Now, I'm not saying we all need to run out and punch holes in our manuscripts anytime soon, but trying to tidy up every last logical loose end is just not necessary. It's better to be immersed in a good story with a plot hole than a bad story with no plot holes. Now, some might say that no good story has plot holes, but that leads me to the second point. That's right, the existence of a plot hole by itself doesn't tell you whether a story is good or not. A story can have a million plot holes, but it doesn't tell me anything about whether or not I can enjoy the story, whether it has a good message, etc. Consider Lord of the Rings in light of the plot hole. There's a beautiful scene in the book and the movie where Samwise carries Frodo up the mountain. He says, "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you." This is a scene that has made grown men cry. This and the SpongeBob movie scene. You know the one. Anyway, the point is, the plot hole seems so insignificant in the light of this scene. The plot hole doesn't tell me how I should feel about this scene, it doesn't tell me whether every other scene sucks or is good or not, it doesn't tell me anything other than the fact that there's a plot hole that exists. Consider all the other elements of a movie too. The music in the movie is amazing. Howard Shore's score is truly beautiful. Or the cinematography and how each shot is a work of art. There's so much more to a movie than just its plot, and to neglect the camera, the music, the acting, and more is just a disservice to the film. Books can have more than plot too. Some have images, but prose and meta-narratives can make or break a book. A plot hole can't tell me whether or not an author's choice of words is good or bad. It says nothing about chapter structures, dialogue, etc. The notion that plot is the only thing that matters is so strange, since there are so many other components to a story. It's this emphasis on objectivity, I think, that is pushing popular criticism in a weird direction. An objective review of Lord of the Rings would be something like this. Frodo and company take a magical ring to the fires of Mount Doom to stop the destruction of the world. It can't speak to any good qualities it may or may not have. Even if we said the plot hole represents an objective flaw about the film, so what? It doesn't bother me or most people. I mean, why should it? Maybe it's better to see it as a subjective strength of the film. Hey, bacon is objectively bad for my health, but I still like it, and who can hate bacon? Anyway, an objective flaw, if such a thing exists for a film, doesn't tell me whether or not I should still watch it. It doesn't tell me if a movie is good or bad or not. Its existence at most could say something about the plot, but it still ignores everything else. And a movie is always more than its plot. That's all I have to say about this. Goodbye.